Welcome, I'm Dr. Brad Olson. I'm a faculty member in art education at Eastern Illinois University, and I'm going to be presenting today on the topic of virtual reality and providing some low-tech ways for even beginner teachers to start exploring this emerging concept in their classrooms. As I mentioned, I teach primarily in the art education program at my university, but I've also had the pleasure of teaching digital art studio courses over the past few years. In these classes, I've found that students are often interested in the topic of virtual reality, but they face several technological challenges when it comes to creating and experiencing work in VR. This is also a topic that I myself had practically no experience working with before doing a little bit of research and workshopping a few ways to make this type of art making more practical and accessible. In this presentation, I hope to do three things. First, I want to define the topic of virtual reality and survey artists who are working in virtual reality today in a variety of ways. Second, I hope to demonstrate a few methods for creating virtual reality art for beginners and for more advanced creators. Finally, I hope you'll leave this session with some resources that will be helpful for you in implementing virtual reality art making in your own classroom. It might be useful to first understand what we mean when we say virtual reality. In general terms, virtual reality is used to describe three-dimensional, computer-generated environments which can be explored and interacted with by a person. We all probably have an image in mind when the term is brought up, and it typically involves complicated and high-cost technology like special goggles, controllers, or computers. What I hope to do is expand our understanding of what types of experiences and artifacts VR might actually refer to. In particular, I'm going to focus on methods for creating 360-degree environments that can be achieved with some very basic technology like rulers, pencils, and other art media, as well as some simple computer or mobile applications. I also want to counter some prevailing notions that working in VR is nothing more than an amusing pastime, but instead can help teach students some important concepts related to the arts that we might already be teaching in our classrooms. In one way, VR-centered projects can help students explore artistic concepts like space and perspective when creating immersive virtual environments. On the other hand, they might also engage students in exploring big issues and themes like place and location in their work in new ways. Finally, the basic skills that we will be learning today can translate and expand into other types of creative work and might even inspire students to seek out more sophisticated ways of engaging with this emerging medium. If you're new to the issue of virtual reality, I think it might be useful to demonstrate how this unique form of media is already being explored by a number of artists in various ways. Some of you might already be familiar with the work of artist Cao Fei, who has been exploring virtual environments in her work for many years. Beginning with an interest in the online social platform Second Life, Fei has long explored how we create avatars for ourselves in digital environments and also create worlds for them to inhabit. In recent years, Fei has partnered with virtual reality developers to create more sophisticated and immersive virtual environments. In a recent piece titled The Eternal Wave, Fei recreates the spaces of the Beijing Hongxia Theater's kitchen as its backdrop. The experience begins in a physical rendition of the kitchen, and from this starting point, the visitor embarks on a multisensory journey through various portals, traversing the boundaries between time and space to explore the computers of the early electronics industry in China and the areas in and around the Hongxia Theater. Elizabeth Edwards is another notable artist who is creating immersive virtual environments in her work. Here we see her spaceship scene created in virtual reality by using tools like Tilt Brush to literally paint in 3 dimensions. Experiencing this artwork allows the viewer to jump into this visually stylized world and examine the elements in 360 degrees. Another artist who is making use of sophisticated VR tech in their work is John Raffman, whose recent piece, Transdimensional Serpent, makes use of the physical space of the art gallery as well as the virtual spaces experienced by visitors we see wearing the headsets. You may wonder, what exactly are the participants viewing? Well, it looks a little something like this. Personally, I find the work of the previous artist I showed pretty interesting and engaging. I'd love to do work like that with my own students. However, the reality is that the technology needed to pull off this sophisticated type of work is still hard to come by for many educators and students. For this reason, I was pleased to find some artists who are working with VR in ways that might be more easily achieved by learners without access to pricey and complicated headsets or have the skills for 3D modeling and animation. The next artists I'd like to show you create fascinating and immersive worlds with little more than drawing medium and paper. One of the first artists I found that was doing this type of work is named Jama Jurabev, and he is largely employed as a concept artist for prestigious media properties like Star Wars. But however, this drawing of a bustling city street was the one that really grabbed my attention, largely because of the flat image's warped and weird sense of perspective. When this flat image is viewed through an online panorama viewer, though, you can see just how this warped sense of perspective drawing takes shape in 360 degrees, allowing us to navigate the scene as though we were standing there ourselves. Once I saw that this was possible, I had to know for myself how it was done, so I did some more digging around. My digging led me to find Arno Hartmann, another artist who uses the same trick to create similar immersive drawings using only a sheet of paper and some basic drawing and painting materials. Here we see an unfolded interior scene. However, by visiting his website, you can see a number of other examples that are made immersive through an embedded web viewer. Again, we're invited to enter a clearly hand-drawn virtual space in a unique and immersive way, even some of his work incorporating media like watercolor. Another artist I found who has mastered this technique is Paul Heaston, whose use of pen and ink techniques also retain the beauty of hand-drawn artworks. By now you may have started to notice a pattern that can be applied to each of these images. It isn't random chance that these artists are able to create these types of pictures. There is a logic that underlies it that isn't so different from the 1-point and 2-point forms of perspective we already teach in many of our classrooms. In fact, this technique is easily teachable if you begin to understand what is called equirectangular perspective. This is a guide that helps the artist understand how to place elements, draw vanishing lines, and deal with perspective in a flat drawing, which then can be translated by simple software and apps into a 360-degree image like we've seen. When we overlay the perspective grid onto the street scene we saw earlier by Jama Jurabev, we can tell that the warped perspective that he draws in follows nearly perfectly the lines of the ER grid. With this understanding, students can be taught to create a variety of immersive and imaginative worlds without the need for high-level computer art skills or technology. So let's get started by just making some art. In this section, I'm going to walk you through a few short demos that will introduce the ER grid by experimenting with first flat abstract shapes, show you how to add dimension and depth to shapes and letters, and then demonstrate the use of this technique to create more complex interior spaces. For each of these demos, all you will need is a printed copy of the ER grid, some tracing paper, drawing media of your choice, and access to a scanner or a mobile device. For beginners, I find it's easier to get them to begin working with the ER grid in the most simple ways possible, thinking about how the placement and scale of simple shapes can create abstract but still immersive environments. Let's start by taping a sheet of tracing paper down on top of our printed copy of the equirectangular grid. From here, I begin instructing students to look for the vanishing points that we see in the grid and drawing in a simple square by tracing along some of the lines. I like to refer to this process as learning how to read the grid, and with some experience you can begin to see how the grid defines basic directions like up, down, left, and right. From here, students can be instructed to try placing different shapes of different sizes and dimensions on various parts of the grid. You might also have them pay attention to overlapping shapes to help show depth. It's also important to point out that at this stage, the 360-degree effect works by wrapping the drawings so that the left edge and the right edge will meet. For this reason, any lines or shapes that continue off either edge needs to match on the other side, like I'm doing with this simple rectangle you see here. When the drawing is complete, I like to define the lines I drew in pencil with marker or pen, and then add some color with a medium like colored pencil or magic marker, although really any color medium will work. After adding some color, it's time to digitize the work. You can do this with a flatbed scanner, but I find that even mobile devices equipped with the free Adobe Scan app can suffice. In this app, all you need to do is place your drawing on a flat surface in a well-lit space, take a picture of it, and then drag the corners into place to crop it accurately. One thing that will make it easier is if you have students place a small reference dot in each corner of the grid before scanning. Once you've done this, you can save your image. To experience it in 360 degrees, you can download the free VR Photo Viewer app, import your photo, and look around. In my classroom, I've provided a few of these cheap VR goggles that work by placing your smartphone in front of the lenses. The nice thing about this app is that you can switch the display settings to stereo view, place your phone in the goggles, and then allow students to look around their scene in a more immersive kinesthetic way. Because this can all be done fairly quickly, students may find a lot of pleasure in experimenting by drawing these abstract scenes, trying them out in 360 degrees, and revisiting their drawings to add more detail or to make changes. Now that we've learned a little bit about how to place simple shapes on the equirectangular grid, let's explore how to move to the next level by adding depth to flat shapes to create recognizable 3D forms. Going back to the drawing board, you can see that I've taped a new piece of paper over my grid and have used it to block out some new flat shapes, and in this case, have used my understandings of the grid to make them into letters. From here, the process isn't so different, but this time, you can instruct students to look for the lines of the grid that run perpendicular to the outline of their shape, or letter, to create depth. By tracing from the corners of the shape toward the vanishing point, you can create the illusion of the shape receding into space. By drawing a vertical line between these two lines with a ruler, you can now adjust how far a shape will go off into the distance. Although this can become a bit more complicated, students with some experience should be able to easily experiment with this process to create new artworks that go beyond flat shapes and begin to represent three-dimensional space more realistically. The same process for outlining, coloring, and scanning as demonstrated in the previous demo will allow students to see their results in 360 degrees. With this new skill, it's not hard to imagine what students will be able to achieve. This could be easily adapted for students to create things like cityscapes, street scenes, or other imaginative solutions. In truth, that's about as complicated as it gets in terms of the principles of understanding the basic ER grid. From here, though, you can experiment to find other interesting ways to create more complex spaces like the artist we saw before. So far, we've been drawing all of our scenes from a basic eye-level vantage point, and largely dealing with exterior scenes. However, it's easy to use the same principle to create an interior scene with just as much complexity. Here I've drawn an example template for a simple room. You'll notice I've followed the ER grid to create 4 equal-sized rectangles, one of which connects across the edges of the grid. By color-coding each of the walls of my drawing, we can easily import this into the Panorama app and see how it looks. Not the most exciting, but we can alter this drawing of this room in a number of ways to make it more unique or interesting. The first thing you might explore is how your placement of the walls above or below the horizon line of the grid affects the vantage point of the viewer. By placing the center of our walls above the horizon line, we're given a lower vantage point. The opposite is also true, and we can get more of a bird's eye or high-angle view by placing the center of our walls below the horizon line. In addition to affecting the vantage point of the viewer, we can also experiment with the shape of our room. By creating two walls that are slightly longer than the others, we can create a more narrow room. This can be heightened to the effect of creating a simple hallway as well. Additionally, artists with some experience using the ER grid can quickly discover how to add doorways, windows, and other elements that sit in the space of a room and make it more unique. Once again, the fun happens when we take this flat image and import it into our VR Viewer app and get to take a look around. With a little bit of practice, I was able to do some really fun things with this technique for interiors. While sitting in our campus museum's studio space, I was also able to draw this depiction of the room I was sitting in through observation. Finally, I couldn't help using this technique to recreate a scene and environment from one of my favorite movies some of you may recognize. The moral of the story is that learning to read the ER grid is a lot less complicated than it seems, and knowing how to place objects on it can allow students to create unique and immersive artworks. Through each of these demos, I hope I've given you the tools you need to get started with this type of art making, even if you're an absolute beginner. I also want to make sure I leave you with some ready-made resources that will help you get started. If you scan this QR code, you'll be taken to a folder that contains a copy of the ER grid, some of my own images and examples and files, and other links to the apps and resources I've used in my demos. If you have any further questions or wish to talk more about any of the ideas presented here, please reach out by email as listed, and I'll be excited to speak with you. Thank you for joining, and I wish you all a very happy virtual conference.